So, all right. Oop, wrong one. Hang on, I have to wait for it to show up here. There we are. All right. So, last week, for those who were here, we looked at two miracles performed by Jesus, Mark chapter 7. One of them was for the daughter of a Phoenician woman, and the other one was for a deaf mute who was living in the Roman Decapolis. And those two stories, those two miracles, taught us that even though Jesus preached to the Jews, his message was for everybody, and God's grace is for everybody. And the way that Jesus healed those people and the way he interacted with them revealed to us that Jesus was not just concerned with outward purity, but primarily with inner faith, inner purity that comes from believing in Jesus. And tonight, we're going to jump back to the Old Testament. We're going to talk a little bit more about faith. And we're going to look at a kind of a strange story that speaks to the grace of God and our faith in God, and more than a little bit foreshadows Jesus. And I think it might be pretty obvious by the time we read it. But we're going to look at Numbers 21, 4 through 9. So I'll give you a second to pull that up on your phone, or I guess just phones, unless you brought your Bible with you. Numbers 21, 4 through 9. The Israelites traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." Then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a bronze snake, put it up on a pole. And then when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. This story comes to us from the book of Numbers, which is probably the most boring name for a book that you could possibly come up with. If you see a book on the shelf and it's just called Numbers, I'm thinking it's a math textbook or something. It doesn't sound all that excited. I'm not excited to pick up and read it. And that's how a lot of people feel about the book of Numbers. That and Leviticus kind of there and there. It's like, let's just jump past that to Joshua and all the battles and the fighting and stuff. The Hebrew name is much more exciting. I don't know why we don't call it this. It's the Hebrew word is Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness, or sometimes translated as wanderings. That's a much cooler name for the book. I wish we'd call it that, because people might be more inclined to read it. And when we meet our Israelites tonight, that's exactly what they're doing. They're wandering in the wilderness. And that's what they're doing for the whole book. They wander in the wilderness. If you don't know the story of why they wander in the wilderness for an entire book, the Israelites are slaves in Egypt for 400 years. God uses Moses to deliver them from slavery from Egypt, or in Egypt, and he leads them to the Promised Land. And when the Israelites get close to the Promised Land, they send in 12 spies to see who controlled it and to kind of scout the land. And those 12 spies come back, and 10 of them are like, "Whoa, these people are gigantic, and there's no way we can possibly fight them. We should just leave them alone." And 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, are like, "Hey, God has given this land to us. If we go in, we will be able to take it." But the people decide to trust those 10 other spies, not Joshua and Caleb. And because of that, God forces them to wander in the wilderness, Bamidbar, our name of our book here, for 40 years, basically for an entire generation. And so all of those unfaithful people, they're going to die off, and it's their kids who are going to inherit the land, except for Joshua and Caleb. So the book of Numbers, as a whole, takes place in those 40 years of wandering. The Israelites encounter a lot of different people during the wanderings. There's actually quite a few, again, it's called Numbers, but there's quite a few stories that are interesting in there. There are also a lot of numbers. It got the name for a reason. There's censuses and stuff, so there's some boring chapters in there. But there's exciting stuff, and there's lots of stories in there. And there's one theme that keeps coming up in Exodus, in Numbers, like in Leviticus 2, all these books, a theme and a kind of a similar story that keeps happening over and over again. And that story, that theme is the Israelites are in the desert, they're wandering, and they get tired or they get hungry or something's wrong, and they start to complain. This is what they do. You would think that a people who'd been enslaved for 400 years wouldn't be so eager to go back to Egypt into slavery, but it seems like every time something isn't perfect, that's what they bring up. They're all in arms to go back to Egypt. And that's basically how our story begins tonight. The people, they're taking the long way around. The Bible tells us they're going around the country of Edom. Those are people who are not very friendly to them, sort of distant relative peoples who they don't get along with very well. They don't want to get in a war. They don't want to start a whole thing. So they're going around. They're taking the long way, but the people get impatient, and they start complaining about the lack of the bread and the water. And not only are they complaining about the lack of bread and water, they also say this miserable food is terrible, right? They're complaining about this food. And what is this food? It's manna from heaven. They're literally complaining about miracle food that shows up on their tent's doorstep every morning. And if that frustrates me when I read it, and I think, like, these people have been through so much, they've seen God work so many times, and yet they still find a way to complain. And if it frustrates you, like it frustrates me, imagine being God for a moment. God has rescued them from slavery, only to find them whining and wanting to go back. And God's brought them to this beautiful land chosen just for Israel, and they choose to not go in and go wandering in the desert for 40 years instead. God provides food for them every morning, even out in the wilderness where there's no crops to grow and there's no animals that are living. And they complain about that too. The Israelites have proved themselves at this point to be stubborn, unfaithful people who just won't shut up. They just will not stop complaining about the good things that God has given them. So what does God do? The Bible tells us He sends snakes among them, venomous snakes that kill many Israelites with their poison. And I think even with the frustration that we feel towards the Israelites, maybe your first reaction to that is confusion or uneasiness or discomfort, right? God's punishment isn't a happy topic. It's not one we're very comfortable with. There's quite a few Christians who would prefer to just not talk about that part. And I admit, it's not a topic that I relish talking about. I don't want to come up here and talk about God's punishment. The message that we like to give, right, is God who loves us, gives us grace, cares for us, not a God who punishes us when we are unfaithful. And the story that we like to tell is true. I'm not saying it's untrue, but we can't cut out this part that we just don't like. And I think for us to understand this, before I get into it, it helps if we read this passage from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 4 and 7. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, "My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son or daughter. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father?" So I know that God's punishment of the Israelites seems harsh to us. It doesn't seem like something that God would do. And yet God punishes them and us in his own way in order to discipline and to grow us, to grow God's people and bring us closer to God. God uses punishment to correct the mistakes of the people, just like a human parent does. And it works. I mean, it works in this story at least. The snakes come, and immediately the people come to Moses, and they beg for the snakes to be taken away because they've learned their lesson. Their first words are, "We sinned. We sinned against God and against you," they say. The people know that it's their sin that brought the snakes, and not some capricious act on God's part. This is not God causing punishment for no reason. So Moses prays for the people, and God tells Moses to take a snake, put it on a pole where people can see it. So Moses makes a bronze snake, just like God said, and he puts it up on the pole, and the people are saved from death when they look at this snake. Now, notice what God does not do. God does not get rid of the snakes. God doesn't remove them. He doesn't do what they asked for. He doesn't answer the prayer in that way. Why? Why doesn't God just get rid of the snakes now that they've asked for forgiveness? That's a tough question. It seems like they've repented, right? Shouldn't the snakes go away? But the thing is, God's mercy, His grace, it's not just a reset button that makes all the problems go away and takes us back in time to before it happened. The snakes are still there. They're not going away, at least not for a while. But now, thanks to God, those snakes have been rendered harmless. Thanks to God's miraculous bronze snake, the real snakes can't kill anyone anymore. And eventually, those snakes will slither away, or the Israelites will pick up and move, and they'll leave the snakes behind. But for the time being, they have to live with the snakes, but without the fear of death. Now, I think that the parallel of this story to Jesus is so clear. And it's not just me who thinks that. Jesus himself noticed it, and he mentions it. In John chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, Jesus is teaching Nicodemus. This is the same, literally right before John 3:16, the most famous passage in the world probably, of "For God so loved the world." This comes right before that. And Jesus says, "Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes may have eternal life in him." When Jesus was crucified and hung up on a cross, he became like that bronze snake that Moses hung up before the people of Israel. The Israelites sinned and brought punishment upon themselves, and God offered a way to neutralize that threat, to save the Israelites from the consequences of their sin by looking upon the snake. In the same way, all of us have sinned. Everybody has sinned, and we have brought punishment on ourselves. But God has again offered a way to neutralize the threat by looking upon Jesus Christ. We still have to deal with the snakes around us, right? This world is still broken because of our sin, because of original sin, the sin that has come down through the world. And our lives are still going to be affected by the ways in which we have strayed from God, the things that we've done to other people. But just because the snakes aren't going to magically disappear doesn't mean we have to fear them in our lives anymore. They don't get taken away, but they do get made harmless. And there will come a day when everything is redeemed, when even the snakes of life, even those sins, the things that have broken this world apart, will be removed. And this creation, this world will be redeemed altogether. But even though that day is not today, we no longer have to fear the death of judgment that awaits us, awaits people who do not look upon Jesus Christ. We don't have to fear that anymore, as long as we look to Jesus. There's a Christian devotional writer. His name is A.W. Tozer. Lived in the early part of the 20th century, and he wrote, "Faith is the gaze of the soul upon a saving God." In the midst of the things in our lives that we bring on ourselves when we walk away from God, or the things that belong to a fallen and sinful world, in the midst of all of those snakes, all we need to do is turn our eyes to the one who was lifted up for us, who took away the punishment for sins through his death and his resurrection. And so let us look upon Jesus for our salvation. And now I'd like to invite us to gather into a couple of groups, and we're going to spend some time.